I married into St. Peter's in 1966. My in-laws live next door in the house, that house, and I became more active as my children grew older, and my mother-in-law was in charge of Sunday school. And I think about 1980 I was asked to take a vestry position for someone who'd suffered a stroke. It's like history since then. It took me a long time to discern for the diaconate, to be a vocational deacon, but this family has been there to kind of support me, and through rectors, through the help of rectors and other mentors, I finally got to this point in 2013 and was ordained in November of 13.
So I've been here a little over 2 years. I was called as priest in charge in 2015 in February, and then became rector about a year later, so yeah, about 2 years. And I was on the East Coast. I was in Providence, Rhode Island before here, so it was a big shift for me. I guess I first learned about St. Peter's story and the history of the church and the history of the evacuation and the interment probably when I was discerning coming here as a priest. I think the bishop had told me about St. Peter's and said, why don't you just go spend some time in the neighborhood walking around and learning about the context. And then when I began to be interviewed for the position here, some of the stories began to come out in the interview process. Really resonated with me deeply, and I think one of the concerns of the search committee was that the priest should be someone who, while not having experienced what it was like to be placed in a camp, to at least be able to be sensitive to a community that had. So I remember in the discernment process about me coming here, we talked a lot about that, and I shared some of my story about being a gay man who had come out and what that had been like growing up, and I think we were able to kind of, while not understanding exactly where we were coming from, to have a sense of what it's like to be in an oppressed group, and so it was a way for us to kind of talk, I think.
So my grandparents and parents were all interned. My father was raised in Japan and came back, but he was interned, and where he met my mother. That's been the hidden story for Japanese Americans pretty much, that I feel it skipped me, the third generation. Like, we never talked about camp, and partly we never asked until we were getting older. The stories from my parents didn't start coming out until my children got old enough to begin asking about some of the things, and then there's very thin strands of these stories that have been revealed. So that still we have now at the 75th anniversary is a kind of a marker year for particularly Pearl Harbor and then of the evacuation and incarceration, that makes it, just really imperative to try to capture whatever stories are remaining. We've already lost the stories of our Issei, the first generation grandparents that came, and then of our parents mostly. And mostly for us, the Husanseis, we have not heard many or hardly any of the stories that have been meaningful, that have affected all of our lives. And so we've carried this burden of shame and guilt and all of that about looking like the enemy and being treated as the other and marginalized and oppressed. And now I think the 75th year being the sort of really the last hurrah in our responsibility to capture those stories as we can, which is sort of, it just intrigued me and has me really kind of wishing I was an archivist by training. It should never happen to another people, culture, and certainly we would pray that would never happen to any other group in the United States, but that it's imperative to bring any story is valid and needs to be brought to the light. So I feel like St. Peter's, we will be 110 years old in 2018, and I think the legacy will always be historically Japanese American, and that the values that we carried that we've talked about amongst our parish now is, of valor and courage, resilience, perseverance, but also with faith, love, and hope in God, and to carry this through difficult times. that this place served as a kind of a refuge or sanctuary, a community center, if you will, the old church, being built in 1933 on this property, that became the center of all of the Japanese community that were Episcopalians. So as they returned from camp and relocated back to Seattle, this place was a place where all the life of the church, all the life was contained in this building. So that legacy continues in terms of us building, I think, on our cultural values, and I see that St. Peter's now is this really quickly evolving community where we have received the remnants of All Saints Parish, plus many newcomers and young folks, and that the strengths that carried us through during these really tumultuous and oppressive times have allowed us now, I think, to reach a point so that we are really truly welcoming, and that we are really recreating and renewing a new spirit on King Street, and that this is a new kingdom of God on King Street.
Well, I think the thing that was just most striking to me about St. Peter's when I came was just the perspective that this community has by virtue of its past and its story, and the people who come here. And it's this perspective of not being at the center of things, of being kind of on the edge, not trying to romanticize it, or but that the people who are coming now are, I mean, they're not Japanese American folks in general, but they're folks who value the diversity of this community in terms of age, in terms of race, in terms of so many different qualities. That's unique in the Episcopal Church in a lot of ways, this particular community, its history, the people who are here now. And I think the people who are coming are feeling drawn here because there's something remarkable about just the mix of people here that they haven't encountered anywhere else. But from what I've been able to understand, it's gone from being a community that was a place of refuge for a particular group of people, Japanese Americans, Anglicans, some of whom came up from California, others who came from Japan, who struggled and fought and saved and built up a church, faced the evacuation, the war, came back, restarted the church, built this beautiful space that we have, and then also wrestled with, from what I've been able to tell, with their identity and whether or not they would stay a Japanese American church.
I think there was some notion, Lincoln Ang came in maybe it was called here in the late 50s, but I had read in a history of particularly the closing of Holy Apostle, or the Black Church, that there was some notion in the sense of trying to have segregation really kind of knocked down, and the tenor of that time, that the bishop really was seriously thinking about trying to close St. Peter's as an ethnic parish, and that Lincoln Ang had something to do with maybe dissuading him to do that in that pressure of the times where he said that the Japanese have been through American concentration camps and forced removal, and that they do not need the upheaval of having their church closed. So I think there were tenuous times in terms of the church being able to support itself. I think that we pride ourselves now on almost always being able to have paid our assessment and being up to date on many things, and that in spite of all of the hardships that we went through, we're able to thrive and build this new place in 1962. Taking a great amount of pride, I think, in building that from the dust and coming back when so many of them families lost everything. And all of those stories a lot of those stories are still buried, with them. And of course, the heyday of the churches, all the mainline churches, was probably in the 60s. So if you see a Sunday school picture or Easter picture from maybe the mid 60s or the early 70s, and there might be 300 people in that photograph, right? And now we have gone through these sort of ebbs and flows of time, and then we're rebuilding ourselves as a new family with different new threads and new cloth. So I'm very excited about all of that. And it takes time in God's time. The Spirit of God works very slowly. Having been through the time after Father Tim retired, I think was a time where the church really had to discern what it was all about. We had never had, after Tim's retirement, a clergy that was Asian. We welcomed other folks, including a gay man, a divorced man, and it was a time when women's leadership was rising. And I think it was really important to go through perhaps a long period where we had many interims or many clergy within the last 15, 20 years to get to this point where we are really this new community that can look forward. And I'm sure, and I think that for me, when Edmund was called to come in as the priest in charge, I kept hearing little whisperings about Edmund from various people, and managed to come and meet him a couple of times while I was still at Trinity, and felt like the Spirit was calling me back here to kind of come home as sort of a bridge person, and having been someone that had been involved from the 70s, pretty much being pretty active, that I hope that I had something to offer to Edmund as a bridge, as a new person to learn about the Japanese community, and then call us as we were to come out into the world, as a deacon would. And so I hope that my dream and my really being very happy to be back home, to be called back home, and to serve in a useful purpose to kind of be a bridge for you.
I think kind of dovetailing on what you said, Polly, just for me, it's the last kind of year or so since I've been here, we've had, there has begun to be there's energy that's kind of pouring into this community that it's really heartening. So it's people, like I say, who've been drawn here from all different walks of life, who are choosing to be part of this community and who want this community to continue to grow and to thrive. And I think we've been doing a lot of just discernment about what that looks like. We've read Anna Olson's book this year, which is a great book, proclaiming the resurrection of the dying church. And I think just trying to be really open to what the Spirit's calling us to become, which may not look like what we currently are, trying to be more engaged in our neighborhood, just more attentive to the ways in which the Spirit's working outside of our walls.
And within our walls at the Refugee Resettlement Office.
Also our neighbors.
And our neighboring, the neighbors. Yeah.
Absolutely. In light of the events in this country and probably around the world, certainly in the last year, there's an incredible poignancy and urgency in remembering the executive order, not just as a historical artifact, but as something that impacted real people. It's funny, I don't think I'd thought about that phrase executive order very much in terms of what it means until there were several executive orders that were passed a couple months ago that like Executive Order 9066 impacted particular groups of people, refugees, immigrants. It was unsettling to connect that with this executive order, which I think around the same time we were remembering the 75 years since it was passed, since it was signed on February 19th. It was right around that same time. I think that gives this community, I think the experience of this community gives us a particular voice, a particular witness within the church to speak with integrity and from experience. And maybe even, I don't know that St. Peter's would see itself as this way, but maybe even in kind of a prophetic way to the wider church. Because when you think about prophets, sometimes they stand on the edge and they're calling a particular institution, maybe the church, to have integrity, to bear witness to what's just, to what's truthful, to what's loving. So I think that's one of the things we're doing now at St. Peter's is we're trying to find our voice and trying to find a way that we can talk about the story of this community in a way that feels authentic to St. Peter's.
And I think it gives us a way to weave all of our voices together in a new way. And I know certainly as a person who's over 70 now, the urgency of what happened here needs to be really proclaimed. The stories need to be unbound. And I think that people using the language, one of the emeritus professors at the UW, Kashima, would say, who controls the vocabulary controls the story. We have this really definite story to tell. It's our story, and we need to tell it now before it's really too late and we've lost all those. And the fact that nearly 120,000 Japanese Americans in the United States were forcibly removed and taken into American concentration camps, right? So nearly two-thirds of the number that went into camps were American citizens. So this is, this is sort of unprecedented. We're the only group that has had this happen to us. Mm-hmm. We will always look like the enemy. We have our yellow faces, and unfortunately, as many years as we've been immigrated to this country, we're still seen as foreigners or outsiders to some degree. And so the story is very important in terms of the civil liberties and the justice that was done without due process, right? So most of us, we grew up kind of glossing this over and not hearing it, but like I'm, particularly with my children and having visited Minidoka later where John was born, such an important story, an American story to tell, and that hopefully we're the only group that, that will happen to. But there's currently some kind of a President's War Act that would allow a sitting president to authorize that again. And we heard earlier in the rhetoric of our new president, and some of his cronies, that mentioning the fact that maybe they could use this executive order as a way to round up Muslims, right? Which was very shocking, because the executive order doesn't specifically name Japanese Americans as the targeted group, but it can be used against any group in a time of war, particularly. So it's really troubling to me, and we feel like we really need to. It's our responsibility now to get this story out and to have the truth be told.
I'll never forget that. I think it was the first planning meeting of the Remembrance Weekend back in maybe September or October, and we were. So it was you and me, and we were sitting at this table in the Sunday school room downstairs with 7 or 8 folks who had been in camp, who remembered it, just gathering together to say, how do we want to remember what happened to St. Peter's, what happened to the community? And I just remember being haunted, because the conversation quickly turned to the rhetoric that was going on then in the election season.
Yeah.
The election hadn't happened, but the rhetoric, the anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim rhetoric was already intensifying, and I think it was Jen Kumasaka who said, something like this remembrance can't just be about history. It can't just be about telling a story. It's very much related to today, and so the way we remember also has to be about engaging in the current climate.
The wider conversation of that, yeah, for sure. Yeah, so we've housed the refugee center for, I think, over 40 years, and I have to say that it was a kind of an uneasy marriage, and we've had some difficult times, and I think that we as oppressed Asians, when it came time to house the Diocesan Refugee Center, were maybe perhaps not fully informed about what that meant, and we were all dealing, I can speak more myself, that I was dealing with the fact that we were pretty soon lumped together as all Asians, and our stories were kind of subsumed in a broader story, and that because we hadn't unearthed a lot of our own baggage about our parents and our grandparents' time in camps, had a kind of a negative reaction to how we were going to support new refugees, which at that time were from Southeast Asia. And it's taken us, I think, a long time to become aware and try to really mature and deal with some of the hard feelings that we felt at the time, and because some of our children were still going through some of the kinds of things that we're facing together. And now, as other groups certainly, and we have children that have outmarried at the highest rate of any, I think, ethnic group. We have seen, many diverse groups coming through the refugee center that we have supported, and that, we as people that have experienced the incarceration on American soil, I think it's really important for us to stand up and be in solidarity with folks. So I feel it's imperative for us now who have experienced this with our Issei grandparents, our parents, and some who are born in camp, that we have matured and grown to be able to attend to some of our baggage about the Refugee Resettlement Office in particular, and in the recent broad support that the bishop and all the parishes have put onto the Refugee Resettlement Office, and the crisis that's happening across the world, that we offer this as a sanctuary house for them, and that we would continue to stand up for the rights of all refugees and immigrants and anyone who is considered the other, because we have been there and marginalized in the same way.
And the really interesting thing too, and beautiful thing, I think, about St. Peter's, many of the people who come here have had some experience of brokenness or being wounded, or experiencing being other. Just a lot of the folks who come here, and I'll never forget that there's a line in the profile that was so stirring for me when I was reading it, when I was thinking about coming here. It's something like, it was talking about St. Peter's after the war, and how it became a refuge and a place of healing for people who had this experience of trauma during the war. And my experience of St. Peter's in the brief time that I've been here is that that's kind of baked into the fabric here. That there is something about this place that people who come here, whether it's whoever it is, people experience pretty profound welcome, but also healing. There's something about this community that it's a refuge. Now, it's not just a refuge; it's a lot of other things too. But I think that it's a place where people can feel safe, secure. And also, the thing I love about this community, it's so refreshing, is that you can be yourself here. There's no pretension at St. Peter's. It's just you can be who you are.
I think that we've had to grow through trying to maybe have a pretense of something we weren't, and then maybe have now come to the point 75 years later, after this experience of being, can be really authentically who we are and share that we, have matured ourselves enough and can now open our hearts and bring a new light into the world, right? And claim what we are. I think that's been a difficult story to do, and maybe finally with this generation, I'm third generation, and with my kids, that's really going to bear the fruit of the kingdom.
One, like at the celebration of new ministry, we used that gospel story from Matthew about the city on the hill, right, and the bushel basket, and not putting your light under the bushel basket. And this community, we have so much light. There's so much light here, and so I think one of our challenges, one of the things that we're growing at, is finding ways to share that light, to be out there.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Yeah. Unbind our stories and let them come into the light.
Yeah, it's a great image.
So I think this year when we read the story, we read the complete executive order on February 19th, was a Sunday. And that was really the first time that many of us, I'm sure, had read it. We have a picture of the poster in our minds that is nailed onto telephone poles that says, "Meet here on a certain day and time with your 2 suitcases." But that executive order essentially ordered Japanese Americans, nearly 120,000 Japanese Americans, to forced removal into American concentration camps. And it was done in different ways and in different cities, but from our information, when we held the last service here on April 26th of 1942, within 2 weeks, which would have been the beginning of May, or around the beginning of May, people were gathering probably at 14th and East Jefferson, I think, was one of the sites, where you were by zones where you lived, ordered to appear at different times in different places. And so it's unclear to me how all of the community, but clearly in this neighborhood, I think 14th and Jefferson was the site where they were probably picked up by buses, taken down to King Street Station, and put on a train to, ironically called Camp Harmony, the Puyallup Fairgrounds, right, which became their home for 3 or 4 months. And by that time, then they were shipped by train, the ones who went to Minidoka, and then the rest were split off to primarily to Tule Lake. Put on trains with the shades all drawn, and had a 2 or 3 day journey over to about Twin Falls, Idaho, or Hunt, where it was, to be welcomed into this desert place, which was not even completed yet, but barracks had been set up just like they were at Puyallup Fairgrounds in horse stalls, with partitions for about 8 families in each of these barracks. And there were like 44 barracks at Minidoka, which were still under construction when they arrived. So to be thrown into, from Seattle's climate, to go into, and I guess it was still a blazing heat in September of 42 when they kind of first went in there. I understand that they were given straw and sort of like pillowcases or whatever. You had to stuff straw in to make your own mattress. You went in there, and the barracks consisted of a big potbelly stove that was in the middle, and then these partitions, and you had to go out to use the bathrooms, and then you had to go eat in a mess hall, which was assigned to you based on where you lived in your block. And so the images of camp, where it was hot, dry, and dusty, and the wind and the sagebrush blew around, and these memories of that, to the muddy ground where it would just rain, and there were planks set on the ground where you would just go to the bathroom in your getas, your little Japanese slippers maybe, or maybe your parents figured out a way to have a little potty in your room so you didn't have to go out in the middle of the night to go to the restroom and stuff. It was very, humiliating, kind of degrading. The fathers particularly didn't have meaningful work to do initially, and some never did anyway, even in these jobs at camp, so that the whole family structure was broken down, and kids sort of ran wild, and teenagers had a great time, and wound up just going with all of their friends to eat at whatever mess hall their friends were, right? So the whole family was kind of tragically broken then. It became a very difficult time for parents to know what to do, and without employment or things that satisfied the life, right? Their normal lives. So when they went to camp, what I researched was that the Episcopal liturgy was different enough from the other mainline Japanese churches, or the Japanese churches, so that they were allowed to form an Episcopal church in camp, which was called the Church of the Holy Apostles. And Bishop Rhea of Idaho and Bishop Houston here were instrumental in trying to get, I guess the national church had to approve that for them to actually form this church in camp. And within the 44 blocks, some of the Niseis were coming of age, that they had 3 bishops' committees that were operating in camp. And then I'm not sure where they worship, but they must have come together. But they kept minutes and all of that. And those were some of the things that we felt had been brought back to the church. But then in a flood in 1977, all those records and the church newsletters and all of that Pat Hagiwara had brought were lost into this thing and all tossed away. But Bishop Rhea kind of shepherded, the flock, and that even though many people were silent during that time, that there was underlying support from the Episcopal Church that carried through. So the image that we used in the invitation, if you've seen it, is of the doors. Someone actually made a pen and ink drawing of the doors that have this wood on it. It says WARA property. And my understanding from having looked in some of the archives with Diane was that the U.S. Army actually rented this building and paid rent to the diocese. And I couldn't find much of the trail, but we were unearthing some stuff in the basement when Jodine was here, so that would be around maybe 2000 or so. We did find some old sawhorses that had U.S. Army on them, and regrettably, that was all thrown away, but that would have been sort of the path. But it was like the cathedral, which was used, as a military base. And so to my knowledge, they continued to use that until they started releasing people from camp. And Joseph Kitagawa comes back earlier to St. Peter's, and there were, I think, still things stored in the gym floor, but a lot of it had been rifled through, and the Army had been using the gym the whole time. And my understanding was then that he, in preparation for the first service, which was held in August of 45, with about 3 to 5 people present, Father Shoji and his family had lost the home that they lived in up King Street, and that they didn't have a place to return to, so that some of the side rooms that are now co-op rooms, or that became Sunday school rooms later, they made into some sort of housing for Father Shoji, and it would have been maybe Sam, Joe, the sister Betty, and they had another sister, so that they lived here at some point. And then they wound up living in a house 2 doors away from my parents on 16th South, and at the time it was Grandpa and Grandma Shoji, and Sam wasn't married yet to Haruko, and Betty wasn't married to Jack Slee yet, but they kind of came and lived in that house. And I remember them sort of coming in there in 1953 maybe, so maybe for they must have had some other housing before this, because obviously the church got up and running after this initial period. But I read that the first service they had back after the war was something like August of 1945. So the stories that we always heard was about the Japanese Baptist Church, because Reverend Andrews is really highly spotlighted, and a lot of us went to this nursery school that Japanese Baptists had. So their whole floor, and they say that St. Peter's floor was marked off in maybe these 6-foot grids with tape, and every family was given a number and a spot, and then you could pile up your goods as high as you could go to get them. And the story about Reverend Andy, and also the Deaconess Peppers from here, they would make these trips back in Reverend Andy's old car. And as time went on and the government would allow people to get things, they would say, "Oh, I need such and such from my pile," and that they would go back to JBC and pick up these goods and then carry them back, so that they went back like hundreds of times. So I don't have any written history in any of the books that I could find of who went back and forth from there to St. Peter's, but it appeared that the same thing happened, that every church, and maybe the Buddhist church had it, and we certainly had like the Presbyterian church and the Old Methodist church, which might have all done the same kinds of things. And mostly, a lot of things were looted, so it sounded like St. Peter's had been broken into during the time, or just by the military using it, that they rifled through people's belongings and a lot of things were missing. But nobody has come forward with a story of saying that we had this square or the things. But the conjecture is that every church did that for their members.
Well, in that Living Church article we read, it talks about the 6 cubic feet.
The 6 cubic feet that you got, right? So. Yeah, so the National Archives, which Diane introduced me to the woman in the National Archives not too long ago, and they were able to find some articles in the Living Church from 1942 that we picked up a little more information, right, about Bishop Reif Snyder coming to be present, and some of the things that a plant was given to the bishop's wife, or a parakeet, and
the 2 rubber plants,
and the rubber plants, and that they were, and the one woman who had saved money to have her dog euthanized
because to get the cats
that she didn't think people could take care of them, so there's the bittersweet stories that come along with that.
Well, there were stories in that same article about how people, it says other Episcopalians offered to take care of the cats and dogs of people from St. Peter's.
Yeah.
I think coming here from the East Coast especially, and being new, it's sort of unbelievable and humbling to remember that it's like just 50 feet from my office door is this space where all this happened. And most days it's filled with preschoolers or basketball players or kendo or all the other mini groups that use our what's now our gym.
Yeah.
But to think that all these events happened there just 75 years ago, like in our space, in this building, I mean, it definitely feels like eerily like walking on holy ground. I mean, it's just...
I think when Jodine was here and we would walk in there, and that was even before we kind of remembered the original altar sort of being there, and it was kind of, all covered up with preschool things, and she kept saying, "I hear these echoes of our angels, the spiritual ones who have passed on," and she kept hearing this, and then we finally opened those doors, and you find that there's that space, and the original stained glass had been covered up And then the altar was rebuilt by her stepfather and a couple men from this church. And then we began to, really honor that as our sacred and holy space.